Hi, and welcome to the History Hut. I'm Jim. This is Dr. K, and in this episode, we'll be talking about India's political history. When we're talking about China, you said it was hard to discuss the period in terms of AD because it's such an old civilization. Is it the same sort of deal with India?
Oh, absolutely. For a long time, scholars said that the original people of India were Aryan. They're probably from the area around Iran, and that they probably came into the area maybe about 1500 BC, which is still, fairly long time ago. But the story on that has changed completely over the last 100 years, and it's quite an interesting story as well.
Well, do tell.
I mean, I suppose that people from India would have been like, well, of course we've always been here and we know that. Right, that would be natural, but of course you have to get the scholars to accept that too, right? Yeah. So anyway, the story goes in 1856 or about 1856, there were two British engineers and they were working on the East Indian Railway from Karachi to Lahore, and they'd already been involved in a little bit of archaeology while they were building field army hospitals in the Dardanelles for the Crimean War, and they'd excavated the site of Troy in that period, so just not just train
I've
guys.
seen the movie.
Yeah, oh, of course. So the problem that they were facing at the time was, how do you get enough foundations down for the track, because the Indus River Valley flooded regularly, and so they decided that what they would do is they would plunder an old deserted city nearby. So like, oh, there's a place with lots of stones, nobody's using it, a place called Harappa. It had this great stone fortification, and it was close by the Ravi River, so it was a pilgrimage site as well. Not that they let that bother them at all. So they pulled it all down, and the trains still run for a couple of hundred miles on the stones that they pulled from this town of Harappa. Now, as you can imagine, Harappa is going to have something to do with our story of how our vision of the past has changed. The workmen found lots of seals, lots of little clay seals with human figures and animals, bulls in particular on them. And so they probably recognized there was something going on here as well, not just a good foundation for the railway. And 5 years later, the first archaeological survey of India was set up, the ASI, and that's 1861. And they, of course, realized right away that there was a bit more to this site than met the eye. And so were very interested in it. And they also realized that the site seemed to be older than the kind of earliest recognized site, the Mauryan Empire of about the 4th century BC. So very, very interested in this. The mystery of the seals that they found, the little seals with the animals and human figures on it, wasn't solved until the 20th century, but it turned out that they're actually Bronze Age, so very, very old, thousands of years old, and that they had come from an urban culture, and this urban culture was gone by the 2nd millennium BC. So they realized that, they had really stumbled upon something fairly ancient. So that was continued on. In 1921, there was an excavation in the Punjab that showed quite definitively that this group that we'd all assume was the first group there, the Aryans, were not the first civilization there at all. And so they did an excavation about the same time, early 20s at Harappa. Of course, Indian archaeologists working on it, and they followed the clues of those engineers from 1856 and then from the ASI of 1861. So they found even more seals, and then they also found the actual site. So they started to dig the actual site, and they found that the site that had been occupied by the Mauryan Empire in the 3rd and 4th century BC actually had an older site underneath it. And so this is what all the excitement was about. And the question was, well, who is it? Is it those Aryans or is it somebody else? So they dug deeper at that site, and they also started working on another site called Mohenjo-daro, the Mound of the Dead. And at first this didn't look particularly promising. It looked as though it was probably just a Buddhist ruin, but again, when they dug down, they found that it was as old as the Harappa site. So just completely changed our view of India. So what did they find? You're probably asking. Just
that was my next question.
A few more seals, a few more little clay things. No, they find an entire city, and this is, of course, the beauty. So they find a huge citadel, this ancient city that covered about 1 square mile, and they found that it had ceremonial buildings, had government buildings, a large hall, a granary, and a huge ritual bathing tank. How huge? 40 feet long, 23 feet wide, and 8 feet deep.
Is that Olympic size?
Well, I believe that would be it would be okay. So
maybe it was the
maybe
Greeks.
they should have used it for the Commonwealth Games last year.
Oh,
yeah, they could have if they hadn't got it finished in time. So they find that, and then they also found that it had a suburb, so it had a whole other living area attached to it with huge mansions, public wells, public toilets, sewers on every block. So it's obviously a really sophisticated place, and the seals that they found dated the site to the 3rd millennium BC. So again, like China, an incredibly ancient place. And on the seals, although there were lots of bulls, and we can talk about why that's important later on, there were also divine figures seated in what you would expect, lotus fashion, in a yoga posture surrounded by wild animals, and this seems to be an early form of Shiva, the lord of the animals. So here you have then in India, in the 20th century, we find out that India has this really ancient civilization, and it looks as though it had been literate at the same time as you would have found that in places like Egypt and Iraq. So the script is still undeciphered. And since the initial digs, they've learned lots more. There's actually, instead of just having the 2 sites, Harappa and Mohenjo-daro, they've uncovered about 1,000 more of these sites, all the way from Afghanistan down to Delhi, and from the foothills of the Himalayas all the way to Bombay. So that's an area larger than Western Europe. So over 1,000 of these sites showing that, that this much earlier civilization existed. But Mohenjo-daro is still, I think, believed to be the largest, with a population of about 80,000. So again, this is an urban culture, and we've talked about the size of cities in China, Hangzhou going up to 400,000. So population, a kind of standing population of 80,000, but in the hinterland, so if you counted all the people around it, about 5 million people in the entire area. So really urban, not just, kind of farmland forever. And the civilization, of course, depended on them being able to provide water to cities like that. So you have water irrigation in the same way that we've seen in the Islamic world. And of course, any city would have to depend on trade, so they have long-distance trade as well. So they seem to have shipped cotton and hardwoods and ivory and precious stones to Samaria. There was a colony of what we now call Indus merchants at the Sumerian town of Ur in Iraq in the 3rd millennium BC, and there have been new digs in the 1970s near Quetta in what is now northwest Pakistan. At the time, we would have just considered that whole area the Indian subcontinent. And showing continuous settlement from the 7th millennium BC, so that's about 4,000 years before Harappa. So incredibly ancient, and showing evidence of farming communities, of craft specialization, long-distance trade. They seem to have been cultivating cotton by the 5th millennium BC, and this tells us, of course, that all of this together tells us that the Indus civilization was Indian. It wasn't from Iraq or from southern Europe. It wasn't Aryan at all. That the original thing was Indian. And it looks as though they spoke the Dravidian language of South India. So the Tamil language now seems to have been the original language of all of India. So we talk about Indus civilization being Dravidian, closely related though to Iran, because you get the arrival of the Aryans about 1700 or 1500 BC. It may have gone into decline because of climate change, because a decrease in rain, and it looks as though the big cities were abandoned maybe as much as 2500 BC. And then at the same time as this decline happens, you have this Indo-European Aryan group who conquered Iran, and they expand into the mountains and then over into India, and they come to dominate, and in fact they assimilate the native Dravidian speakers, and they actually spread through the whole Ganges area. They burned forests ahead of them. They cultivated land, and they pushed the Dravidians into the south. So the darkest skinned people end up in the south. They have the original language, and they seem to now, you know, be recognized as the original people of India. So if you hadn't known that before, you'd be like, okay, no biggie. But if you had grown up thinking that it had been an Aryan civilization that had conquered and then kind of created Indian civilization, then you'd be in for a big shock. You'd be like, oh, can't believe that.
Quite a change.
And they bring their religion with them, and that religion is seen, kind of morphs into Hinduism.
So do you get the rise and fall of empires like we saw in China?
Yes, you do. In fact, there are a few really important ones. One of the key ones is the Mauryan Empire, and that's about the 4th century BC. So again, you know, still fairly early, but important, because as with our discussion of China, a lot of the things that you see happening in the Mauryan Empire are continued on. You can still see some of the philosophy and some of the kind of intellectual stuff going on much later on, so you can't really talk about India without mentioning the Mauryan Empire. This is the first attempt at political unity in India under the Mauryan Empire. The capital city was Patna, the city of Patna on the Ganges, visited by Greeks who were stunned to see its size and its beauty. So again, you know, outside visitors are going to be telling us quite a lot about India, including Buddhist monks coming from China to look for Buddhist scriptures and sutras coming into India.
You had some good stories yourself too.
Yeah,
I
certainly
visitor.
did. As an outside visitor to India, I certainly did. Patna is the city size was about a 22 mil rectangle. It had almost 600 towers, about 60 or 70 gates, and a population of about 400,000. So again, 4th century BC, Mauryan Empire, really, really sophisticated, bigger than Rome at the time, and not a slave-based society either, which is interesting because, of course, the Romans have slaves. The ruler that there's two rulers that we know a lot about. The first one is Chandragupta Maurya, and he was a Jain. And again, some of the fundamental elements of the Jain faith we'll see emerging in Buddhism and also in Hinduism. So it continues on. He ended his life in the typical Jain tradition of resigning his leadership and then fasting until he died, and that was about 322 BC to 297 BC. And probably the most famous of the Mauryans is his grandson Ashoka. And as you said, I was happy to see Ashoka's pillars all over the places in India. I would be like, oh, look at that. And the guy, the cultural guide that I was with, kept saying, oh, the cigarette, because they're kind of tall and white and skinny. And I was like, no, Ashoka's monuments. So Ashoka, his grandson, reigned until 239 BC. Reigned for about 35 years. Remember, we're still going towards zero. And he was famous for his approach to ruling. And after killing about 100,000 in battle, a famous battle in Orissa, he said, change of heart, little quote, "I will try to conquer by right conduct alone." And right conduct, of course, we'll associate later on with the word dharma, to do things properly, to do things as you should be doing them. So Ashoka had his edicts inscribed on these Ashoka pillars that you can see throughout India, explaining dharma, how this right conduct, but he's not really religious. This is a kind of secular idea of the dignity of people. It's kind of humanism. A lot of his ideas are about compassion and tolerance and truthfulness, and also non-violence after killing the 100,000. Non-violence, no meat eating, the conservation of animals, not burning forests needlessly, and he passes a lot of social legislation. So he looks to reason and morality to frame legislation. So that's one of the most important of the early empires. I'll just finish there and
very good.
Go on.
Very good. So that's part one of our discussion of the political history of India. Join us for part two.